going to shift paces right now and bring out, again, representing Travelers. He is their director of inland marine claim at Travelers. Craig Leinauer, it is your hour. What's up, brother? How are you?
Hey, I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How was your weekend? And did Valentine's Day go okay?
Valentine's Day went great. I got to tell you, it was actually very romantic for a change.
Oh, that's awesome. I love to hear it, man. And I appreciate you for again being on the show. And I want to talk because you see cargo claims every single day. And when a loss happens, what's the first mistake you see when companies that end up kind of complicating the claim?
Yeah, so by far the most common issue we see is late notice, right? I mean, look, cargo claims are going to happen, and that's not a mistake, but the mistake is waiting too long to report them. In some cases, companies don't report a loss until many weeks later when invoices are received or accounting shortages show up. And the challenge with late notice, of course, is that it limits the ability to respond effectively, right? So because, evidence will become unavailable, documentation, for example, can be incomplete, and then it gets really hard to determine what actually happened. So really, from a claims perspective, it's important to report the claim as soon as you can, as soon as possible, so that the investigation can get started promptly.
Sounds like some critical advice. And so once a claim is reported, and we hope it's reported the right way, what's another mistake that could cause some issues and problems?
Well, another one is, report the loss immediately, even if all the details aren't known. Early notice is going to allow the adjuster to get involved right away to preserve evidence, document conditions, and then guide you on next steps. So it also is going to help you, by the way, avoid potential issues with contractual or statutory deadlines. So, for example, if you have a COGSA, shipment that's subject to COGSA or CARMAC, there may be a claim filing deadline. It's going to help you keep ahead of that. But the key is really to have a process in place and then training your people to recognize that when something goes wrong, it really needs to be reported right away. So let me give you a claim example. So we recently had a $500,000 shipment of stolen baby formula. And in this case, the carrier reported it right away, and our adjuster was able to assign a theft investigator immediately who worked with law enforcement and then recovered the entire shipment. So we actually ended up paying out $0. We saved $500,000, and that's not an insignificant amount of money.
No, it's not at all. And I want to ask a follow-up to that because what does good documentation actually look like in practice?
Yeah, so good documentation is going to be proactive and consistent, right? So you're going to want to photograph cargo, the condition at pickup and delivery, especially if something feels off. You're going to want to keep seal records. You're going to want to document exceptions right away. And then you want to make sure that paperwork stays with the load and then it's retained afterward. Good documentation doesn't just help you from a claim perspective, it's going to help protect your company's position overall on many, many levels.
It's phenomenal advice, Craig. Now, another issue we hear about a lot is the confusion around cargo value. Now, how does this show up specifically when it comes to claims?
Yeah, sure. This is a really big one, actually. Not knowing the value of the load before it moves, right? So there's an important distinction between liability and insurance coverage. Insurance only pays up to your policy limits, but your liability can go way beyond that depending on what's in your contract or how much the cargo is actually worth, what the valuation is. So if you don't verify that shipment value up front and you confirm that they're within policy limits, what can happen is you can accidentally end up exposed to losses that exceed your insurance coverage, right? So this is a very common mistake that we see. Fortunately, it's easy to prevent if you're proactive.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, can you give us an example of how this value discrepancy, how it occurs and to make sure that it doesn't? Because I know there's a lot on the line when it comes to this.
Yeah, so let me give you an example. So we recently had an insured who was hired as a motor carrier to pick up an industrial scissor lift. The trailer was hit by a train and the cargo was destroyed, unfortunately. The carrier's contract required it to have $100,000 in insurance, and it made them strictly liable for any damage. The problem was they never checked the value before they picked it up, right? It turns out that the scissor lift was worth $350,000. So they thought their liability was capped at 100,000, but that was just their insurance coverage and not their actual liability limit.
Oof. So if I'm paying attention, we've heard that late notice of a loss Poor incomplete documentation and not knowing the value of a load are common mistakes that people often make when filing an insurance claim. But are there any other thoughts specifically when it comes to this?
Yeah, really two other big ones to mention, right? Failure to mitigate your loss and then not understanding your contract. So first, mitigation. You can't control when an accident happens, right? But what you can control often is how big the exposure gets, how big that loss becomes. So what you want to do is you want to salvage what's not damaged. You want to get temperature controlled storage lined up as fast as possible if it's needed, and then you want to avoid any premature disposal. So let's say, for example, you have a 7 pallet shipment of ice cream, and 2 of the pallets get damaged in an accident, but 5 of the pallets are still intact. Get the undamaged pallets to a freezer as soon as you can to salvage what you can. And then secondarily, contracts. Contracts can shift liability in ways that people just don't expect. A motor carrier can waive defenses contractually that they otherwise have under the law, and a freight broker can assume liability that they wouldn't otherwise typically have. So if contracts aren't reviewed carefully in advance of when the loss happens, coverage and exposure can quickly become misaligned. You really need to know what you're signing.
That is such good insight. Now, kind of walk us through with this wrap up. I mean, what are the fixes for common claim mistakes?
It's really just being proactive. You want to report your loss promptly. You want to document aggressively. You want to know the value of what you're moving before you pick it up. You want to mitigate whenever possible, and you want to understand your contracts before the loss happens. Now, of course, these steps won't prevent every loss, Malcolm, but what they will do is they'll make a significant difference in how smoothly the claim is handled and also how much exposure you have.
One of the best in the industry, as always. Excellent stuff, Mr. Craig Leinauer. Craig, thank you so much for being here on the show, man. It was super insightful and always love having you on.
Thank you, Malcolm. It is truly my pleasure.